Hi. This video will show that Israel's 2023 attack on Gaza meets the legal definition of genocide under international law far beyond any reasonable doubt. In part 1, we will look at the definition of the crime of genocide and analyze some of the precedents set in actual genocide cases that are relevant to this one. Then in part 2, we will analyze the facts on the ground, referring back to what we went over in part 1 to show that Israel has committed genocide. Finally, in part 3, we will consider which individuals or entities could be found liable for the crime if they were to face trial. Let's begin. The legal definition of genocide is entirely derived from the UN Genocide Convention. This definition is somewhat contentious as it is very, very narrow. To give a prominent example of just how narrow it is, the Cambodian genocide, which involved the killings of something like 2 million people, is practically universally considered to have been a genocide outside of the legal sphere. Yet in practice, it was actually mostly prosecuted as a crime against humanity rather than genocide, because the prosecutors didn't think that they would be able to meet the lofty requirements to land convictions for the latter. So other broader definitions are often used outside of the legal context. But we're not going to be getting into those debates here, because this video is solely about whether Israel's actions in Gaza in 2023 constitute genocide according to this narrow standard set by international law. So here's how the Genocide Convention defines the crime of genocide. Genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. A. Killing members of the group. B. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. C. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, in whole or in part. D. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. E. Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. A very important part of this definition, which is often not very well understood, is that genocide is a crime that is defined by certain actions being taken with a special type of intent. This is different to other crimes like murder, which are not only defined by actions and intent, but also by result. A murder is not a murder without a dead person. But genocide is different. It's a common misconception that genocide requires killing on a massive scale, in the hundreds of thousands at least. This is simply not the case. In fact, genocide can still be genocide if no one dies, because out of the 5 listed genocidal acts, only one of them actually requires killing to have occurred, and any single one of those acts being carried out is already enough to meet the definition of genocide. Said acts are very likely to result in death, but it's not necessary for them to. As legal scholar Janine Clark summarized, what is crucial is that the perpetrator intended to destroy a group in whole or in part, not that he succeeded in doing so. This is important to establish early, because a common argument that I've seen is that not enough people have been killed in Gaza for it to constitute genocide. Sometimes, for example, people post graphs of population growth, which they seem to believe make it impossible for a genocide to have occurred. But this is totally irrelevant, because the crime of genocide is defined by actions and not outcomes. So this argument would already be invalid, even in spite of the completely obvious fact that the specific events under examination here only began on October 7, 2023. And thus obviously are not encompassed in these graphs. There are also no provisions in the definition of genocide for any mitigating circumstances. This was made clear by the Tribunal for the Rwanda Genocide. The 1994 genocide, where around 800,000 members of the Tutsi ethnic group were murdered by members of the Hutu ethnic group in Rwanda. The judges found that mitigating circumstances could only be taken into account when passing down sentences after guilt had already been established, and that they did not alter the degree of the crime itself. This is relevant because some have argued that what Israel has done in Gaza cannot be genocide because it is a reaction to the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th, and also because many have argued that Israel cannot be committing genocide because the Palestinian militant group Hamas allegedly has genocidal intent itself. This has included the highest government officials of Israel's staunchest ally, the USA. Here is what US President Joe Biden's spokesperson had to say on the matter.
But this word genocide is getting thrown around in a pretty inappropriate way by lots of different folks. What Hamas wants, make no mistake about it, is genocide. They want to wipe Israel off the map. They've said so publicly, more than one occasion. In fact, just recently.
Even if we were to take the statements that he's making there to back that argument at face value, none of it matters at all, because there is nothing in the definition of genocide, nor in precedents set in previous genocide trials, that would render you no longer guilty of genocide if you argue that you were provoked, or that the other guys also want to genocide you. Nor does it matter if there is a war, real or imagined, nor does resistance from the victim population change anything, nor does anything. Genocide is quite simply any or multiple of the 5 specified genocidal acts taken against a group with the outlined special intent to destroy them in whole or in part. And there are no extenuating circumstances that make genocidal actions with genocidal intent not genocide. These are also the sorts of arguments that have been made to justify pretty much every genocide ever, by the way. The other side is pretty much always claimed to have attacked first, or done something or want to do something to the perpetrators that supposedly legitimizes their genocide. So the definition is really quite clear, and it can mostly be taken as written without much of a need for interpretation for most of it. There are 2 parts that are not immediately clear though, and this is where it gets more difficult. What exactly constitutes adequate proof of intent to destroy, and what constitutes a part of the targeted group? The meaning of "in part" was covered during the Srebrenica trials. Before continuing, it's important that I elaborate on what the Srebrenica genocide was, as it and the trials surrounding it will be referenced continuously throughout this video. In July 1995, Bosnian Serb separatist forces began an assault on the Bosnian Muslim enclave of Srebrenica. They justified their attack on the town by claiming that they merely wanted to demilitarize the Bosnian troops who were defending it. Sound familiar? After capturing Srebrenica and the surrounding areas, they rounded up more than 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men and teenagers who they considered to be of military age, and massacred them. They also killed a smaller number of women and children. Some of the victims were probably prisoners of war, but most were civilians. Despite being just one localized massacre in which a gendered subset of the group was specifically targeted, this event on its own was ruled a genocide by the UN's International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. This established an important precedent that is very relevant to Israel's 2023 attack on Gaza, a legally declared genocide localized to a relatively small area in which a low number of people were killed relative to the overall population of the group and relative to the common perception of the scale of killing that constitutes genocide. This is relevant to Israel's attack on Gaza, as at the time of recording this, at least 17,000 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces, and this figure is likely a substantial underestimate. We will be going into further depth on the veracity and reliability of this death toll in part 2. Unlike in Srebrenica, where almost all of the dead were adult males, most of the dead in Gaza come from groups which are much less likely to contain many combatants. 70% are children, women, or the elderly, and the remaining 30% who actually are so-called military-aged men undoubtedly still includes many non-combatants. This number constitutes about 0.6% of the total Palestinian population in Gaza. This is a higher proportion of the overall population than the 8,000 victims of the Srebrenica genocide were, as they constituted about 0.4% of the total number of Muslims in Bosnia, and they were still ruled at trial to constitute a sufficient part of their overall group for the massacre to be ruled a genocide. Another reason that the people in Srebrenica were ruled to constitute a sufficient part of the overall group was due to them being a local subgroup of the overall population, the Bosnian Muslims of the town of Srebrenica. The physical destruction may target only a part of the geographically limited part of the larger group, because the perpetrators of the genocide regard the intended destruction as sufficient to annihilate the group as a distinct entity in the geographical area at issue. This same principle can easily be applied to the attacks on Gaza. Gazans are a subgroup of Palestinians, and Israel has attacked further subgroups of the Palestinian population of Gaza in specific locations, such as in North Gaza, Gaza City, or numerous other cities or towns. I also want to note from that quote there, this part specifically, the perpetrators of the genocide regard the intended destruction as sufficient. So the perpetrators don't need to be trying to eliminate this whole part of the group. What matters is that they regard their level of killing as sufficient to achieve their goals. So the killings of the Palestinians in Gaza by Israel clearly meets the standard of in part in multiple aspects. Genocidal intent, however, tends to be more difficult to establish, and most genocide trials rest entirely on whether the special intent required for genocide can be proven or not. The popular perception of genocidal intent is that it requires explicit statements from the perpetrators to the tune of, "By golly, we really want to kill all the members of this group." So they can murder a ton of people of a specific group, but as long as they're careful to never openly state their intentions, that makes it not genocide. But that's not actually the case, nor could it be, because those carrying out genocide are rarely, if ever, so open about their intent. Rather, they use euphemisms, lie about why they're doing what they're doing, or just plain deny what they're doing. And that's why, legally, genocidal intent is actually mostly inferred from actions. In the Srebrenica trials, for example, the judges decided that the massacres of Bosnian Muslim men in Srebrenica were, on their own, sufficient evidence from which to infer genocidal intent, and thus declare that a genocide occurred. It was ruled that the factual circumstances permit the inference that the killing of the Bosnian Muslim men was done with genocidal intent. The scale of the killing, combined with the awareness of the detrimental consequences it would have for the Bosnian Muslim community of Srebrenica, and with the other actions taken to ensure that community's physical demise, is a sufficient factual basis for the finding of specific intent. So, Srebrenica was ruled to be a genocide based off the killings alone and the context surrounding them, even before considering any statements of genocidal intent from the perpetrators. So, how is it that this intent is inferred then? Well, this was also explained by the judges during the Srebrenica trials. In one case, it was found that it is permissible to infer the existence of genocidal intent based on all the evidence taken together. And another expanded upon this, finding that factors relevant to this analysis may include the general context, the perpetration of other culpable acts, systemically directed against the same group, the scale of atrocities, the systematic targeting of victims on account of their membership in a particular group, or the repetition of destructive and discriminatory acts. The existence of a plan or policy, a perpetrator's display of his intent, through public speeches or meetings with others, may also support an inference that the perpetrator had formed the requisite specific intent. So basically, intent is not established by looking for some sort of smoking gun clear statement, as it is sometimes assumed. Rather, it is established by looking at all of the actions of the perpetrators and all of the evidence combined, and coming to a logical conclusion. No statements of intent even specifically needed. When all of this is put together, a judgment can then be made as to whether or not a genocidal pattern of conduct has been proven, meaning the non-accidental repetition of similar criminal conduct on a regular basis, undertaken in a fashion where there is an improbability of random occurrence. And in the Rwanda genocide trials, there was another finding which complements this. The offender is culpable because he knew or should have known that the act committed would destroy, in whole or in part, a group. To give you an example of how intent can be inferred using these principles, if Israel bombs an apartment block and kills 50 Palestinian civilians, but then Israel takes heed of what resulted from their actions and does not repeat the same action again, then from context alone, we can clearly conclude that the killing of those civilians was not carried out with genocidal intent, because once it became clear that such actions were killing so many Palestinians, they stopped doing them. So while the individual act might be a war crime or a crime against humanity, there would clearly not be any genocidal pattern of conduct. But if Israel bombs an apartment building, killing scores of civilians, then bombs another apartment building, killing scores of civilians, then another, then another, then another, then another, then suddenly we now have a pattern of conduct in which the non-accidental repetition of similar criminal conduct occurred on a regular basis, and where they clearly knew or should have known that this would result in scores of Palestinian civilians dying, both from the fact that it had happened before, and also from the incredibly obvious fact that residential buildings are where civilians live. So that continuation of these massacres of large amounts of Palestinian civilians over an extended period of time could alone constitute evidence of a genocidal pattern of conduct, and thus genocidal intent can be inferred from them, even absent any clear statements of such intent. And this is exactly what Israel has been doing in Gaza, a repetitive pattern of bombings of residential buildings and civilian infrastructure, while they are well aware of the fact that they're killing many civilians. The more and more that keeps happening, the clearer and clearer it becomes that there is an improbability of random occurrence. So the more they do it, the more evidence there is of genocidal intent. Keep this in mind as it's going to be relevant later on when we go over the facts of this case in part 2. Further evidence of intent can also be inferred from actions that, while not listed as genocidal acts in the definition, nonetheless can form part of a wider genocidal pattern of conduct when said pattern of conduct does include genocidal acts. During the Srebrenica trials, for example, one judge noted that other actions, such as forced population transfer and the destruction of homes, can form part of a genocidal scheme and thus provide additional evidence of genocidal intent. This same finding was also affirmed many times in other trials. This also has vast historical precedent. The Nazis, for example, forcibly transferred some Jews while simultaneously murdering many others, and forced population transfer was an integral part of the Native American genocide in the USA, as well as the Armenian genocide by Turkey. As we will go over in more detail in part 2, forced transfer and the mass-scale destruction of homes have both been integral parts of Israel's strategy in Gaza, and this constitutes further evidence of their genocidal intent. The reason why inferences are so important in cases of genocide is pretty clear, because as mentioned earlier, in most genocides, the perpetrators go to pains to try and hide their intent. But things are actually very different here, because Israel's leaders have made many public statements of genocidal intent since October 7th, and some of their leaked plans point clearly towards genocidal intent. Now I'm going to go over a lot of this more direct evidence of genocidal intent, far more than any court would ever really need to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. All of this comes solely from Israeli government and military officials. First, a leaked document that was produced by Israel's intelligence ministry on October 13th, whose authenticity the government has acknowledged, reveals an extensive government plan for the complete depopulation of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. The document assesses 3 different options for Israeli goals in its wars on Gaza. It argues against the first 2 options, which would involve Israel setting up puppet Palestinian governments in Gaza and allowing the population to remain, and instead recommends what it calls the evacuation of the civilian population from Gaza to Sinai in Egypt. It proposes the forced removal of the entire Palestinian population via evacuation orders, the setting up of tent cities in Egypt for the 2.4 million expelled Palestinians, and explicitly states that the evacuated population would never be allowed to return. This is affirmed elsewhere in the document, where it is proposed that these forcibly removed Palestinians would be integrated within a state framework with citizenship, meaning that Egypt or other host nations would permanently absorb them. It even says that the Israeli government should contract advertising agencies to get the victims to accept this plan. I quote, "The messages should revolve around the loss of land, making it clear that there is no hope of returning to the territories Israel will soon occupy, whether or not that is true. The image needs to be, Allah made sure you lose this land because of Hamas's leadership. There is no choice but to move to another place with the assistance of your Muslim brothers." Further corroboration of their intent to do this is evidenced in another similar Israeli government plan that was revealed in an article by Israeli news outlet Israel Hayom, published on November 30th. This plan, drawn up at the request of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, aims to thin out the population in Gaza to a minimum by forcing them into Egypt or into the sea. And on December 25th, the Israeli government openly admitted that they are planning to organize so-called voluntary migration for Palestinians, an obvious euphemism for forced migration. There is nothing voluntary about Palestinians leaving Gaza, because as will be clear later on in this video, they're not leaving anything for them to go back to. And while I'm editing this video, they've come out with yet another statement of intent to forcibly transfer nearly all Palestinians out of Gaza. On December 31st, the finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, said in an interview on Israel's army radio that, "We will live in the Gaza Strip. We will not allow a situation in which 2 million people live there. If there are 100,000 to 200,000 Arabs living in Gaza, the discussion about the day after will be completely different. They have been living in a ghetto and in suffering for 75 years. Forced transfer is already a war crime on its own. And again, while it's not on its own a legally genocidal act, it can nonetheless be part of a wider genocidal scheme when carried out alongside genocidal acts. And in such cases, it also provides further proof of genocidal intent. As we'll go over in detail in part 2, Israel has already carried out forced transfers out of the north of Gaza on a massive scale, and has also started forcibly transferring people who are in the south even further south. So their actions very heavily indicate that they have in practice been attempting to implement these plans. Now let's go over some of their statements. And remember, this is just the public ones. Imagine how bad it is behind closed doors. Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, October 29th. You must remember what Amalek did to you, says our Holy Bible. This is a reference to a call for complete and total genocide in the Bible. I remember that which Amalek did to Israel, how he laid wait for him in the way when he came up from Egypt. Now go and smite Amalek, and utterly destroy all that they have, and spare them not, slay both man and woman, infant and suckling. Netanyahu has since then made numerous other references to this same call to genocide, such as in this tweet, as well as in a letter he wrote to IDF soldiers who are invading Gaza. Netanyahu also said on October 7th, "We will turn Gaza into a deserted island. To the citizens of Gaza, I say, you must leave now. We will target each and every corner of the strip." Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant said on the 9th of October, "I have ordered a complete siege on the Gaza Strip. There will be no electricity, no food, no fuel. Everything is closed. We are fighting human animals, and we will act accordingly." This is a clear statement of genocidal intent by the standards of Stipulation C, deliberately inflicting on a group the conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in parts, as they know or should know that depriving people of food, water, electricity, and fuel are actions that will contribute to their physical destruction. It also clearly meets Stipulation B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. Major General Ghassan Alian, the head of COGAT, the Israeli government organization responsible for the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, said the same thing on October 10th. Human animals must be treated as such. There will be no electricity and no water. There will only be destruction. You wanted hell? You will get hell. On October 13th, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant also said, "Gaza won't return to what it was before. We will eliminate everything." That is the Defense Minister of Israel making just about the clearest statement of genocidal intent imaginable. Avi Dichter, the Israeli Minister of Agriculture, said on November 11th that the Israeli government was rolling out the Gaza Nakba, a reference to the 1948 Nakba, where Israel expelled 750,000 Palestinians from their land and homes and killed about 15,000. The Energy Minister, Israel Katz, said on October 13th, "All the civilian population in Gaza is ordered to leave immediately. We will win. They will not receive a drop of water or a single battery until they leave the world." Nissim Vaturi, Deputy Speaker of the Knesset, said on October 19th, "Erase Gaza. Nothing else will satisfy us. Do not leave a child there. Expel anyone who remains there when it ends, so that they won't re-establish." On October 12th, he also said, "Not a single Hamas member will remain, and regarding the people of Gaza, we will also have to find a solution for them, in my opinion. Why are we supposed to be the stupid ones who take the garbage that no one else wants?" The Israeli Minister for Women, May Golan, said on October 7th, "All of Gaza's infrastructures must be destroyed to its foundation, and their electricity cut off immediately. The war is not against Hamas, but against the state of Gaza." On November 2nd, Israeli Minister of Heritage Amihai Eliyahu posted on Twitter, "North of the Strip, beautiful as ever, blow up and flatten everything. Simply a delight for the eyes. In my spirit's eyes, we give out plots to all those who have fought for Gaza. That's a clear call for the expulsion and killing of all Palestinians, the destruction of their homes, and the colonization of Gaza by Israelis." Eliyahu then went on to say on October 5th that there is no such thing as non-involved in Gaza, clearly stating that civilians are valid targets. He then said that dropping an atomic bomb on Gaza was a possibility. Statements like that there are no non-involved in Gaza, is part of a trend of very clear attempts by Israeli government officials to blur the line between combatant and civilian, in order to legitimize their killings of civilians. Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich posted on November 19th on Twitter that he agreed with every word of an article by retired IDF general and government advisor Giora Eiland, published in Israel's most circulated newspaper. The article states that Israel should not differentiate between civilians and combatants in Gaza, calls for total war against the entire population, and recommends that Israel seek to cause mass death among them by intentionally spreading diseases, a clear and obvious call to genocide. The president of Israel, Isaac Herzog, said on October 13th that it is an entire nation out there that is responsible. It is not true, this rhetoric about civilians not being aware, not involved. It's absolutely not true. They could have risen up. They could have fought against that evil regime. And Israel's official social media accounts have been trying very, very hard to legitimize its attacks on civilians in Gaza, posting tweets like this, for example, which aim to frame Palestinian civilians as terrorists and thus as legitimate military targets. This is supplemented by more examples of dehumanizing rhetoric coming from the highest echelons of the Israeli state. The best example of this is that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has, multiple times, referred to Israelis as the children of light and Palestinians as the children of darkness, and called the Israeli war on Gaza a struggle between humanity and the law of the jungle, clearly framing Israelis as good and human, and Palestinians as evil and animals. He also said this in his aforementioned letter to the IDF soldiers who are attacking Gaza. That's already a ton of statements of clear genocidal intent, either to commit acts that are plainly genocidal, or to commit acts that can be part of a genocidal scheme when carried out alongside such genocidal acts, such as forced transfer, the destruction of civilian infrastructure and homes, etc. And I didn't even include the many statements from, for example, members of the Israeli parliament who aren't government ministers, former government or high-ranking military officials, from military officers or soldiers, from government advisors, from intellectuals, from celebrities, or from influential organizations. Though just for good measure, I have included a very extensive list of such statements in the source list of this video, at the source number that you see on the screen now. So everyone who I cited is or was at the time a high-ranking government or military official, making clear statements of genocidal intent with no euphemism. In the Srebrenica genocide case, there was nowhere near this level of quality nor quantity of explicit statements of clear and obvious genocidal intent from such high-level government officials. And this is despite the fact that the Israeli government, though they are evidently very bad at it, tries to be careful with its public image. One day they'll say that every single Palestinian civilian is guilty while massacring them in droves. Another, they'll swear up and down to be humanitarians, who consider every Palestinian life to be precious. Legal scholar Edina Basirovich calls this practice genocidal double rhetoric, attempts to hide the true intent behind genocidal practices by, well, simply lying. In Israel's case, this often manifests in them being much more frank about their intentions in their Hebrew language communications, which are intended for the internal Israeli audience, or for internal government use, while they are far more careful with their English language ones, which are much more likely to be disseminated to the international news media. That is why almost all of the statements of genocidal intent that I cited here were actually made in Hebrew. The Israeli government's reaction to one instance, where one of these genocidal Hebrew language statements was translated and disseminated unexpectedly in English to a much broader international audience, was itself a very good example of their genocidal double rhetoric. When comments from Heritage Minister Amiyai Eliyahu about nuking Gaza, mentioned above, caused an international uproar, Prime Minister Netanyahu's office made a statement to the international media that said, Eliyahu's statements are not based in reality. Israel and the Israeli Defense Forces are operating in accordance with the highest standards of international law to avoid harming innocents. Yet when speaking directly to his ministers, Netanyahu was much more candid about his real problem with Eliyahu's statement. Every word has meaning when it comes to diplomacy. If you don't know, don't speak. We must be sensitive. They tell the international media that the statement is incorrect because they're supposedly very committed to protecting civilians. Yet amongst themselves, there is no mention of civilians. And they make it clear that the real problem with such statements is not that they imply the mass killing of Palestinians, but rather how bad they make Israel look diplomatically, how they give the game away. This is the very essence of genocidal double rhetoric. Those comments made by Netanyahu to his ministers very eerily echo those made by Bosnian Serbian military commander and convicted genocide perpetrator Ratko Mladic to the Bosnian Serb parliament in 1992, where he instructed his fellow Bosnian Serb leaders on how to use double rhetoric to mask genocidal intent. We will destroy Sarajevo. We need Sarajevo. We are not going to say that we are going to destroy the power supply pylons or turn off the water supply. No, because that would turn America out of its seat. But what if one day there's just no water at all in Sarajevo? Why it is, we do not know. And the same with electrical power. We have to wisely tell the world it was the Bosnians who were shooting, that they're the ones who hit the transmission line and the power went off. They were themselves shooting at the power supply facilities. That is what diplomacy is. Every word has meaning when it comes to diplomacy. That is what diplomacy is. The parallels with Bosnia are many. What Israel is doing in Gaza is infinitely more in line with the clearly genocidal statements that I cited than it is with the double rhetoric that Israeli officials use to try and legitimize their crimes to an international audience whose intelligence they clearly have no respect for at all. So on that note, what exactly is it that they've done in Gaza? We've already identified that the Palestinians in Gaza constitute a sufficient part of an ethnic or national group, and established the clear genocidal intent of the Israelis, and explained how their genocidal intent can both be inferred based on actions and their clear statements and plans. So now, let's take a more detailed look at their actions, and while keeping in mind everything that we've just gone over, analyze how said actions fit the legal definition of genocide and provide further evidence of genocidal intent. I'm going to cover the two clear genocidal acts that Israel has carried out here first. Its bombing campaign against civilians, and its deliberate deprivation of electricity, water, food, housing, and other essentials to sustain life. Then I'll also cover the acts that it has carried out that are legally not genocidal on their own, but that, as explained earlier, can nonetheless form part of a wider genocidal scheme and be used as further evidence of genocidal intent. Israel started bombing Gaza almost immediately after the Hamas attack on the Israeli border settlements on October 7, 2023. Since then, such airstrikes have remained their primary means of attack, and they have killed masses of civilians in a succession of hundreds of massacres. Gaza health officials have confirmed 17,700 deaths at the time of me recording this on the 10th of December 2023. Most of the dead have been killed by Israeli airstrikes, with perhaps a couple thousand being killed as a result of the Israeli ground assault. As is often the case during genocides, Israel and its supporters have disputed this figure, claiming that it is made up by Hamas, who, according to them, run the health ministry directly and manipulate its figures. But this simply isn't the case. The Gaza Health Ministry's accounting of the dead has always been nearly perfectly in line with independently calculated casualty counts in previous conflicts, so it has long proven itself to be reliable, and there's no logical reason to be suspicious of it. This death toll is also not just a mere estimate. Rather, it is the actual number of dead bodies that have been counted at hospitals and at morgues throughout Gaza by medical professionals there. Once, on October 27th, in response to denialist comments made by US President Joe Biden, the Gaza Health Ministry released a full list of all the dead up until that point, including names, age, sex, and ID card number for 6,747 victims and 281 additional dead who had not yet been identified at the time. There is no reason to believe that they have lowered their standards since then, especially since the death toll has continued to rise at a similar steady rate. This data was later analyzed in an article published by The Lancet, one of the world's most prestigious medical journals. The authors concluded that it is implausible that this data has been fabricated. This is an extremely high standard for counting the dead, one that certainly results in a figure that is much lower than the real figure, because during violent attacks like this, or war, or whatever, there are always countless dead who never make it to a hospital or a morgue, and who aren't found until much later, and others who simply remain missing forever. And there will be some who don't even have any relatives or friends left to even report them missing. Despite President Biden's denial, Other US government officials have been more candid about things. Barbara Leaf, the US Assistant Secretary of State for Middle East Affairs, said that the death toll is likely higher, and US intelligence officials announced on October 11th that the Gaza Health Ministry's death toll is roughly accurate. And another academic assessment published in The Lancet corroborates this, titled "No Evidence of Inflated Mortality Reporting from the Gaza Ministry of Health." It concludes that the death rate of UN staff in Gaza, which is an independently calculated figure directly from the UN itself, is actually significantly higher than the Gaza Health Ministry's overall death rate for the general population. This indicates that, if anything, the real death toll is probably higher. So, Israel has killed over 300 people per day since the beginning of their assault. A shockingly high figure that's even more shocking when you consider the very high percentage of the dead who were very unlikely to have been combatants. Combined, women, children, and the elderly are 70% of the dead, while children alone are 40%. More children were killed in just 3 weeks of Israel's attack on Gaza than in all violent conflict globally for the entire year of 2023 up until that point. And of the remaining 30% who are actually men of military age, it's also safe to assume that many of those people were also not combatants. If we were to assume that even 10% of the dead were combatants, that would likely be very generous to Israel. It is very relevant that Israel has at its disposal the most modern, precision, state-of-the-art weaponry. This indicates that it chooses the targets that it hits very deliberately. It is also very relevant, though not very well known, that Israel's hold over Gaza is so complete that it actually controls the Gaza population registry. So, when it bombs a residential building, or a block of residential buildings, or an entire neighborhood, it has a list of everyone who lives there. It knows how many of their family members live nearby, and how many of them could potentially be visiting. It knows precisely how many people, how many children, how many elderly could be killed or injured. Then it bombs them anyway. Such actions, carried out in a repetitive fashion, with the consequences being both blatantly obvious and also very precisely known by the perpetrators, clearly constitute a pattern of conduct, of actions, repeated hundreds of times over for an extended period of time, which Israel knows or should know will kill large numbers of Palestinians of certain geographical subgroups that constitute a part of their wider ethnic or national group. From this, genocidal intent is easily inferred, whether or not there is a Hamas member in every single building it has ever bombed. Let us address that claim real quick, though I want to make clear first that it is irrelevant, as the genocidal intent is clear whether it's actually true or not. For one, it's just obviously a ridiculously untrue claim. Israel has bombed practically every square inch of residential area in North Gaza, as well as in large parts of South Gaza. It's clearly not possible for there to have been Hamas militants or Hamas military installations in all or even most of these areas at the time of their bombings, given that Israel itself estimates that there are 30,000 Hamas members, and at least some of these are likely not even fighters. A BBC investigation based on satellite imagery estimated that, by the beginning of December 2023, around 100,000 buildings had been damaged in Gaza as a result of Israel's assault, further complicating this justification. The idea that every building hit in the now nearly completely leveled north of Gaza housed one of these 30,000 alleged Hamas militants or their military infrastructure is patently absurd. Israel's own estimate of the amount of Hamas fighters that they have killed, which should be taken with a massive grain of salt, as they lie about everything, have huge incentive to lie about this specifically, and have provided absolutely no proof aside from their word, is 5,000 at the time of recording. Aside from being clearly inflated, it's also just an impossible number, as it would require basically every single military-aged male that Israel has killed to have been a combatant, and we know for a fact that's not true. But even if we take that made-up propaganda number at face value, we'd still need to buy that they've damaged 100,000 buildings with the most accurate precision weapons in the world in order to get to only 5,000 fighters. They have destroyed 60% of all housing units in the Gaza Strip, in which around 1.5 million people lived, just to get to 5,000 supposed combatants. They claim to have attacked a grand total of 22,000 military targets, yet they have destroyed or damaged 100,000 buildings and 250,000 residential units. It doesn't add up at all. With numbers like that, it would be much more plausible to assume that they've been trying to destroy the houses and kill the civilians, and have accidentally killed the militants in the process, not the other way around. And this argument is even more ludicrous in reality, because the number of dead fighters is certainly much lower than what they say. For an interesting comparison, the incredibly intense fighting in and bombing of Germany's most important cities in World War II destroyed 45% of their housing stock. 45% over the course of multiple years versus 60% in 2 months. You'd have to be either brainwashed or just knowingly spreading propaganda to buy Israel's justifications here. So even giving them all the benefit of the doubt in the world, taking all of their numbers at face value, their claimed motivation for bombing civilian buildings is simply not possible. There's also further complications to this justification, like the fact that it is a war crime anyway to kill dozens of civilians who are in their own homes to get to one or just a few militants, especially if said militants are not at the time actively engaging in hostilities, as was definitely true in most cases, at least before Israel launched its ground invasion of Gaza on the 27th of October. It is also a war crime regardless to carry out targeted killings of combatants when they are off duty and in their own homes, as in these circumstances, they are not legally considered active combatants, unless they are commanders who are actively planning or directing current or future military operations. And I'm pretty sure Hamas does not have 5,000 commanders. So even ignoring the fact that considering any question of proportion or discriminate targeting makes these bombings very clear war crimes, the justification of we bombed those apartment buildings because a Hamas member lived there would not be considered valid in the vast majority of cases regardless. In fact, it would be a very clear war crime. There is also, even despite all of that, absolutely no indication in the legal definition of genocide, nor in the case law, that it's not genocide provided that your pattern of conduct also results in the death of some combatants. Israel's practice of sometimes calling residents and telling them to evacuate buildings before it destroys them also complicates this justification, because if they were really bombing buildings in order to kill Hamas members, then it makes no sense to warn the people in the building beforehand, because obviously the Hamas members are going to evacuate as well. In these instances, their clear goal then is simply to destroy the residential buildings for the sake of destroying them. And this is both a war crime and a crime against humanity in of itself, as well as further evidence of genocidal intent when considered alongside their genocidal actions. And I'm going to be expanding upon this later in this section when I go over their destruction of housing specifically. That they kill many without warning, while also giving others some warning to evacuate before destroying their homes, is also not a mitigating circumstance for genocide, as killing some members of the group while sparing others and nonetheless destroying their homes, and thus their ability to continue to live in the region, is a common practice during genocides, and one with a clear precedent established in Srebrenica. Further evidence that Israel's bombing campaign against civilians is very intentional is provided by an expose by the Israeli news outlet 972 magazine. Anonymous IDF whistleblowers told them about how the IDF has been selecting its targets during its assault on Gaza, and they paint a picture that makes Israel's genocidal intent even more obvious. According to these whistleblowers, the Israeli army has files on the vast majority of potential targets in Gaza, including homes, which stipulate the number of civilians who are likely to be killed in an attack on a particular target. The number is calculated and known in advance to the Army's intelligence units, who also know shortly before carrying out an attack roughly how many civilians are certain to be killed. This is something that's already clear just from Israel's control of the population registry. They already know where everyone lives. Nonetheless, this report provides even more evidence of genocidal intent, under the principle of knew or should have known. To quote more of the article at length, in one case discussed by these sources, the Israeli military command knowingly approved the killing of hundreds of Palestinian civilians in an attempt to assassinate a single top Hamas military commander. The numbers increased from dozens of civilian deaths permitted as collateral damage as part of an attack on a senior official in previous operations to hundreds of civilian deaths as collateral damage, said one source. Nothing happens by accident, said another source. When a 3-year-old girl is killed in her home in Gaza, it's because someone in the army decided it wasn't a big deal for her to be killed, that it was a price worth paying in order to hit another target. We are not Hamas. These are not random rockets. Everything is intentional. We know exactly how much collateral damage there is, in every home. In the majority of cases, the sources added, military activity is not conducted from these targeted homes. I remember thinking that it was like if Palestinian militants would bomb all the private residences of our families when Israeli soldiers go back to sleep at home on the weekend. The article also refers to testimonies by Palestinian witnesses who claim that the army has also attacked many private residences where there was no known or apparent member of Hamas or any other militant group residing. Such strikes can knowingly kill entire families in the process. This article, while credible and corroborated as reliable by other media outlets, is nonetheless based mostly on anonymous testimonies, so take it with a grain of salt if you want. Even without it, there is already more than enough evidence in Israel's pattern of conduct to infer genocidal intent. Its control of the Gaza population registry, and the revelations made in this article just make it even clearer that Israel knows exactly what it's doing. Its claim to be targeting Hamas members would not only change nothing even if it were true, but the facts show that such claims are often justifications concocted to carry out attacks on civilian targets. An investigation into two typical examples of Israel's bombing of civilian buildings was undertaken by Amnesty International. They sent investigators to the sites of a church and a house, which were bombed on October 19th and October 20th, respectively, killing a total of 46 civilians, including 20 children. 18 people were killed at the church, and 28 were killed at the residential building. They interviewed 14 witnesses, including 9 survivors. Israel originally posted video of the church bombing to its official social media accounts, claiming that IDF fighter jets struck a command and control center belonging to a Hamas terrorist involved in the launching of rockets and mortars towards Israel. After this video was cross-referenced with satellite imagery, which revealed the fact that it actually showed the strike on the church, Israel deleted all of the evidence from their social media, and have since ignored all requests for comments, opting to instead hide the evidence and pretend that it never happened. Hundreds of civilians, including dozens of children, were sheltering in the church at the time of the bombing. Church officials had publicly stated this, so they 100% knew all of this before they decided to bomb them, yet did so anyway, then knowingly lied, saying their intentional massacre of civilians was an attack on a military target on their social media. The attacked residential building, a family home, was located in the Al-Nusrat refugee camp in the central Gaza Strip, an area which Israel had told residents of North Gaza to evacuate to, ostensibly for their safety. The strike also destroyed 2 neighboring homes. Amnesty's investigation found that everyone present in the 3 homes at the time of the strike were civilians. 2 members of the family of the main house that was targeted had permits to work in Israel, meaning that they had passed Israel's rigorous background checks, had been cleared of any association with Palestinian militant organizations, and Israel had their address on its books. So they knew precisely that they were targeting a family with no militant connections, and also that doing so would probably kill those in the adjacent houses. As Amnesty International points out, in cases like these, even if the targets were actually used for military purposes, and there's no evidence of that by the way, the strikes would still be clearly indiscriminate and thus constitute war crimes due to the massive number of civilians that Israel knew would probably be there and thus be killed and hurt as a result. Additionally, they would still be part of a repetitive pattern of genocidal conduct in which the attacker knew or should have known that their actions would massacre large numbers of civilians. But we have no reason whatsoever to give any credence to Israeli claims that these buildings or any other buildings were used for military purposes, or even that there were any combatants in their vicinity, as Israel has simply not provided any evidence of that. Thus, given the clear and obvious consequences of bombing such civilian buildings and Israel's foreknowledge of the fact that these buildings would be full of civilians, the only logical inference to make from the evidence is that Israel intentionally targeted civilians with the intent to kill civilians. These 2 cases are exemplars of Israel's pattern of genocidal conduct in its bombing in Gaza. They are very knowingly attacking such targets and providing absolutely no evidence of their military use or the presence of active combatants. And that doesn't matter anyway, because as said, these attacks would still be war crimes and acts of genocide, even if their justification were true. Israel has also killed shocking numbers of journalists and the families of journalists, many of them in targeted strikes on their homes. It is abundantly clear that such a massively disproportionate number of journalists could not be killed in such a short time frame unless the killings are part of a targeted and intentional effort to kill those reporting on Israel's crimes in Gaza. It is also important to note that this systematic targeting of civilians and civilian buildings is hardly without precedent. It is a practice that Israel has continuously engaged in, at least since 2006. In that year, they developed a strategy which they call the Dahiya Doctrine, a plan of action for the intentional mass targeting of civilians concocted for their war with Lebanon that year. It's named for the Dahiya neighborhood of Beirut, which was devastated by Israeli bombing and shelling during the war. General Gadi Eisenkot, then head of the Israeli military's Northern Command, spoke publicly and openly about the existence of this strategy in 2008. "We will wield disproportionate power and cause immense damage and destruction. This isn't a suggestion, it's a plan that has already been authorized. Harming the population is the only means of restraining Nasrallah." Eisenkot has since then continuously held high-ranking positions in the Israeli government, and during this Israeli attack on Gaza, he was Minister without portfolio, thus a high-ranking member of the government that's carrying out these attacks. The evidence that Israel is intentionally targeting Palestinian civilians and Palestinian civilian infrastructure is simply overwhelming. All in all, it's simply not possible to bomb with the most advanced modern precision weaponry with the intensity and frequency as Israel has, tens of thousands of apartment buildings and homes, and other such civilian buildings and infrastructure, without intending to kill civilians and destroy the capacity for civilian life of the targeted group in the attacked area. Israel's justification for doing this do not hold up to any level of scrutiny, are contradicted by the long list of statements of genocidal intent and genocidal plans from high-ranking government and military officials, and are irrelevant regardless, given that their pattern of conduct of carrying out attacks against residential buildings and killing large numbers of civilians has remained the same for a prolonged period of time. Their intent is to attack members of the Palestinian ethnic and national group, to destroy them in part, and this is evidenced far beyond any reasonable doubt through inferences that can be derived from their genocidal pattern of conduct and through said genocidal statements. Israel has already, since long before this present attack on Gaza, surrounded it and blockaded it, and it has thus controlled everyone or everything that gets in or out of the tiny Gaza Strip. It has, since October 7th, cut off Gaza's electricity and water supplies, while also prohibiting most imports of food, leaving people starving, without clean drinking water, and sentencing those who need electricity to survive, such as critically ill or injured hospital patients, to death. Exactly in line with the prescriptions for the so-called human animals of Gaza that were set out at the beginning of the genocide by Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. This is especially horrible because the entire reason that Gaza's people are at Israel's mercy in the first place is because most of them are descendants of the Palestinians who were expelled by Israel to the tiny Gaza Strip from their land and homes in the 1948 Nakba. This has left them trapped in this tiny enclave that cannot possibly fulfill its own needs for clean drinking water, electricity, or food, which is completely surrounded by Israel's military. Israel previously already used its complete and total control over what gets in or out to blockade them, and there was even one point where it would specifically regulate how many calories they were allowed to eat. Since beginning its assault on Gaza in October, it has massively increased the already severe blockade's severity. According to the UN, even prior to this Israeli assault and its ramping up of the blockade, 80% of Gaza's population were reliant on humanitarian aid for basic necessities, and 500 aid trucks entered the Gaza Strip per day to fulfill these needs. Then, after the attacks began, there was an entire month where Israel only allowed an average of 12 aid trucks to enter per day, meaning that 80% of Gaza's population was only receiving 2.5% of what they needed to survive, which is horrifying since they already lived in poverty and with food insecurity beforehand. In December, this number has increased to around 100 trucks per day, which is still only 20% of what's needed for even basic subsistence. The reason for aid being reduced so severely during a time of war, where you would logically think that the exact opposite would be happening and more aid would actually be getting shipped there, is a combination of Israeli attacks on the Rafah border crossing with Egypt and Israel refusing to allow the aid through. It's a common misconception that Egypt, not Israel, has been preventing the import of this aid to Gaza. While the Egyptian government is clearly complicit with Israel Israel, it is not at all the primary party responsible. Israel has, since 2007, had an agreement with Egypt that gives Israel control over who and what is allowed in or out of Gaza through the Egyptian border. So it is Israel who decides how much aid is allowed to get in. Israel has been trying to mask its intentions with its devastating blockade of the vast majority of aid and food and imports in general to Gaza by gradually allowing slightly more aid to enter. That lets it paint itself to the international audience as actually caring about the people of Gaza, thus helping to mask its genocidal intentions. Yet the broader context shows that Israel has blockaded, and at the time of recording still is blockading, the vast majority of aid to the Gazan population that mostly relies on it to survive. It has heavily restricted aid to starvation levels, not provided any. For Israel to frame itself as graciously allowing the entry of humanitarian aid, when this aid is at least 5 times less than what was entering the Strip before this conflict, is like the Nazis framing themselves as gracious humanitarians because during World War II, they let some aid enter Greece to relieve a famine that they themselves had caused. There's also a precedent that rubbishes any idea that Israel allowing any symbolic level of aid through to alleviate the mass suffering that they have caused would mean that there can't be a genocide. In the Rwanda genocide trials, the chamber considered the fact that in some cases, some of the perpetrators had provided assistance, such as food and shelter, to refugees of the genocided group. They nonetheless found that the aggravating factors outweighed the mitigating factors, and that those who had rendered this aid were still guilty of genocide. So this blocking of aid to far below pre-October 7th levels, combined with the deliberate deprivation of water and electricity, are actions that, when sustained for an extended period of time, as they have been, Israel clearly knows or should know would contribute to the physical destruction, in whole or in part, of the Palestinian population of Gaza. And that's, of course, exactly what has actually resulted from their actions. Only 10% of the population has access to clean drinking water, and on December 9th, 2023, the Deputy Director of the UN World Food Programme said that half of the population of Gaza is starving, and that 9 out of 10 Gazans are not even eating 1 meal per day. Additionally, the international NGO, Save the Children, warned on December 9th that at this rate, deaths from starvation and disease, caused by the conditions that Israel has intentionally imposed on civilians in Gaza, may result in more deaths than those killed by Israeli bombs. They report that UN statistics from December 2023 show that almost 8,000 children, that's just children, not including adults, were already suffering from severe wasting, which is the phase of starvation that precedes death. Save the Children staff in the Israeli-declared safe zone of Al-Mawasi say the situation is desperate, and that they have spoken to people there who report not having eaten in 3 days. They directly accuse the Israeli government of using starvation as a method of warfare. They also note that the sanitation conditions in this tiny area that Israel has forcibly expelled millions of people to are absolutely horrible. Hundreds of people are sharing single toilets. Sanitation services are inoperable, and human waste is piling up. It seems clear that Israel is implementing the plan, widely approved of in the Israeli press, to intentionally cause epidemics among Gaza's civilian population. Even if Israel somehow did not foresee these obvious consequences of their actions, they have since been very well informed of them, and they've also seen them for themselves. Yet they have nonetheless maintained their blockade, continued depriving the population of electricity and water, and forced Palestinians into smaller and smaller areas where disease is more and more likely to spread. The only reasonable inference to make here is that these are intentional genocidal acts. This clearly constitutes deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in part, and also additionally constitutes causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. Now we will move on to examining actions that, standing alone, may not be genocidal acts according to the legal definition, but which can form part of a genocidal scheme when carried out in tandem with genocidal acts, and thus can be used to provide even further evidence of genocidal intent. As established earlier, the destruction of homes can be an additional part of a genocidal scheme when it is carried out alongside genocidal acts. It is a tactic that Israel has used many times before, and which, as we went over, they have an entire military doctrine centered around. Israel has destroyed 60% of the housing in Gaza in just 2 months, in a bombing campaign against residential buildings that can only be described as systematic and intentional. One report from the BBC provided a first-hand look at what this sadistic destruction of homes in Gaza sometimes looks like on the ground, even in the few instances where residents have been warned beforehand. On the 19th of October, the same day as the aforementioned strike on the church, Mahmoud Shaheen, a dentist, suddenly received a call that turned out to be from Israeli military intelligence. They told him that they were going to bomb 3 residential apartment towers, and gave him 2 hours to spread the word and evacuate people from the area. Then, they bombed the 3 buildings, rendering hundreds of people homeless. Later that day, Mahmoud received another call, again telling him that more apartment towers would be bombed, and again tasking him with getting everyone to safety. Israel then leveled 3 more buildings, rendering hundreds homeless once more. Then they suddenly called him again and told him they would bomb an entire street this time, consisting of more than 20 apartment towers. They then did so. This repeated over and over again for the entire night, until the entire neighborhood was destroyed. By the end of it, nothing was left of this neighborhood, and the residents had no choice but to leave, rendering it functionally wiped out. This account details a sadistic practice, which alongside the more conventional Israeli practice of just killing everyone inside the building, was clearly intended to cause the systematic, near-total destruction of housing in that neighborhood, leaving the residents no option but to pack up and leave permanently, effectively resulting in the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from that area. The pictures that you see on the screen now show the extent of the destruction in this neighborhood, Al-Zahra. The 972 magazine article provides further insight into this practice. According to the anonymous IDF whistleblowers, the Israeli military intentionally attacked what they call power targets, large residential buildings and other important civilian buildings, in what they call a deliberate attack on Palestinian society to exert pressure on Hamas. So basically the Dahiyya doctrine. This term, power target, is actually one that the IDF proudly uses in public, but not in English, of course, only in Hebrew. Hebrew language IDF spokespeople often gleefully tell the Hebrew language media the exact number of power targets that they've hit. On October 11th, for example, they announced that half of the around 2,700 targets, which they had hit up until that point, had been these so-called power targets, meaning civilian apartment buildings and civilian infrastructure. So at least half of the targets that they had bombed were civilian ones, not attacked for any military reason, deliberately targeted as part of an attack on Palestinian society itself. And for another taste on just how different the Israeli media is when dealing with the Israeli audience rather than an international one, they've gleefully released before and after satellite photos themselves to the Israeli media showing their destruction of entire neighborhoods. For them, this is a positive thing that they happily announce to the Israeli public. They're not at all hiding the fact that they are systematically destroying civilian homes in Gaza and Palestinian livelihood with them. When standing alone, the destruction of homes is not an act of genocide, but the intentional mass destruction of homes in Gaza by Israel is being carried out alongside explicitly genocidal acts, and that is thus a clear element of Israel's wider genocidal campaign, part of an attempt to destroy the capacity for Palestinian life in North Gaza at the very least. Some are killed while others are expelled and have their homes destroyed to ensure that they have nothing to come back to. The only possible inference from this is that there is an overall intent to eliminate them as an identifiable group from the targeted geographical areas. Israel ordered the complete evacuation of people in North Gaza to South Gaza early on in its assault, ostensibly to protect civilians, while stating that anyone who does not leave could be considered a terrorist partner and thus a valid target for killing. This is analogous to the sort of threats that were made by Bosnian Serb paramilitaries during their attacks on Bosnian civilians. For example, Serbian commander Ratko Mladic told Bosnian Muslims, "You can go anywhere you want, or you can stay here and just vanish." The implication in both of these cases is clear. You must leave, or risk being murdered. These are not humanitarian evacuations. These are threats designed to force residents to leave. This is a clear case of forced population transfer, regardless of Israeli attempts to frame it as some sort of humanitarian evacuation. More than 1.1 million people were made to leave North Gaza, while Israel simultaneously bombed the evacuation routes and the supposed safe zones that it had told them to leave to, killing hundreds of the refugees who they had created. And as we just went over, it has also destroyed homes in the north en masse, ensuring that most of these people have nothing to return to anyway. Since the initial evacuation orders for North Gaza, they have also greatly expanded the zones from which they demand people leave, while also continuing to bomb the ever-shrinking safe zones that most of the population has since been forced into. By November 23rd, a total of 1.7 million Palestinians had already been displaced, around 70% of the total population of Gaza, and this number has undoubtedly increased since. Many people have been forcibly expelled, then been forcibly expelled again from the place that they were forcibly expelled to, multiple times. Many others were forcibly expelled, only to then be killed by an Israeli bombing in the supposed safe zone. This is not the conduct of an actor that has anything resembling the intent to allow the population to return. It is in fact completely in line with the Israeli government's plans for the removal of the entire population of Gaza that we covered in part 1. They are being forced into an increasingly small area on the border with Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, exactly as planned. Israel also has a very long and notable history of the forced removal of Palestinians. It forced 750,000 Palestinians from their homes in the 1948 Nakba, then mass murdered those who tried to return to reclaim their stolen property. It has since then expelled countless more, and still does this even today outside of Gaza, in the West Bank and Jerusalem. In not one case has Israel ever allowed the people who it has forcibly expelled to return. There is no reason whatsoever to assume that this time is going to be any different. If Israel somehow, by some miracle, does allow Palestinians to return to the ruins of their homes, it would only be because of immense international pressure and resistance from Egypt to its Sinai removal plan, rather than because they ever actually intended to allow it themselves. And when it comes to determining genocidal intent, it is solely the intent at the time of the action that matters, so that eventuality would not change a thing regarding if this is genocide or not. Applicable here is a finding from the Srebrenica trials, where the appeals chamber accepted the prosecution's argument that the suffering of the women, children, and elderly forcibly removed from Srebrenica amounted to serious mental harm under the definition of genocide. This precedent could easily apply to other instances of forced removal, including this one, especially given the much larger scale of it and the fact that Israel has continued to attack the Palestinians that have been forcibly removed, causing even more serious mental harm. This would mean that, given that only one of the 5 outlined genocidal acts needs to be taken with the requisite genocidal intent, it is possible to argue that the forced removal of 1.7 million Palestinians and counting through causing serious mental harm to them is genocide on its own. Though given the other genocidal acts that Israel has committed, such an argument is probably overkill. The point is, though, that the fact that genocide can be demonstrated from so many different angles emphasizes just how clear of a case of genocide that this is. Israel has been justifying their atrocities in Gaza with the claim that they are simply waging a war against Hamas, who have governed Gaza since 2007. If we were to take them at their word on that, that would mean that their goal in Gaza is regime change, to destroy Hamas and replace it with a new government more amenable to their interests. But even if we ignore everything that we've already gone over, that makes it abundantly clear that this is not true, there is another part of their conduct which on its own shows this justification to be a blatant lie. Israel has very publicly and very proudly been doing everything they possibly can to destroy the very potential for the existence of Palestinian civil society, Palestinian self-governance, and Palestinian cultural life in Gaza. You can't do regime change when there's nothing left. As they've occupied more and more of Gaza, they have started conducting conducting controlled demolitions of the region's most important institutions. They have demolished Gaza's Supreme Court and its Legislative Council building, institutions that clearly would be needed for any functional post-Hamas Palestinian government. Videos of these demolitions have been gleefully disseminated by pro-Israel social media accounts, some of whom have ties to the Israeli government. These are just two of the most important of the more than 100 government and municipal buildings destroyed by Israel since the beginning of their assault. These are not the actions of an occupier who only wants to get rid of Hamas, but rather one who wants to get rid of the possibility for organized Palestinian politics in Gaza entirely. Gaza's educational infrastructure has also been systematically attacked, with many schools and universities being destroyed or damaged. Al-Azhar University was bombed and practically destroyed, and the Islamic University of Gaza was also bombed. The president of the latter was then also killed in a targeted assassination, along with his family. The destruction of universities and educational institutions is a clear means of destroying the population's potential to generate new political leaders and intellectuals in the future. They have also been systematically bombing important cultural institutions. For example, some of Gaza's most important libraries have been destroyed by Israel. They have also destroyed and damaged many churches and mosques, such as the 1,000-year-old church of St. Porphyrius. They even bombed the Central Archive of Gaza City, destroying priceless documents pertaining to Gaza's history that were up to 150 years old. While this sort of systematic destruction of Palestinian cultural, political, educational, and religious institutions are not legally genocidal acts by themselves, they are further evidence of Israel's genocidal intent and also clearly form a further part of its genocidal scheme. This is especially true given that the jurist who originally coined and defined the term genocide, Raphael Lemkin, considered the destruction of social, political, and cultural institutions to be some of its key elements. He wrote, "Generally speaking, genocide does not necessarily mean the immediate destruction of a nation, except when accomplished by mass killings of all members of a nation. It is intended rather to signify a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of national groups, with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. The objectives of such a plan would be disintegration of the political and social institutions, of culture, of language, national feelings, religion, and the economic existence of national groups, and the destruction of the personal security, liberty, health, dignity, and even the lives of the individuals belonging to such groups." That is a perfect description of what Israel is doing in Gaza, not just in regards to this point here about its destruction of political, cultural, and religious life, but in general. That's exactly what they're doing. Israel has clearly committed genocide in Gaza, and at the time of making this video, said genocide is still ongoing. Since October 7th, 2023, a plethora of unambiguous and very public statements of genocidal intent have been made by high-ranking Israeli military and government officials. These statements have been accompanied by genocidal acts on the ground, clearly directed towards the goal of rendering impossible the existence of the Palestinian population of Gaza, exactly as outlined in the multiple plans that we know of that have been created by the Israeli government. Israel has carried out a systematic bombing campaign of civilian buildings in Gaza, resulting in the completely foreseeable mass killings of civilians, 70% of whom have been women, children, and the elderly. Their ostensible justifications for doing this simply do not align with the facts at hand, where 100,000 buildings have been destroyed, including 60% of the region's housing stock, and hundreds of separate massacres of civilians have occurred. The probability that such a repetitive pattern of targeting of civilian buildings and massacre is a mere random accidental occurrence is zero. Their bombing campaign thus clearly constitutes a repetitive pattern of conduct in which they are carrying out the non-accidental repetition of similar criminal conduct on a regular basis, while they knew or should have known that the acts committed would destroy, in whole or in part, a group. This constitutes more than enough evidence from which to infer, as was done in Srebrenica, genocidal intent from the acts themselves. Their intentions during this campaign are clearly to destroy the Palestinian population of Gaza, Gaza City, North Gaza, and other more localized geographical areas through the genocidal actions of A, killing members of the group, and B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. Israel's prolonged deprivation of water and electricity to Gaza, and its refusal to allow anything resembling sufficient food and medical aid clearly constitute genocidal acts under Criteria C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in parts, and Criteria B, causing serious bodily harm to members of the group. Additional acts simultaneously being carried out by Israel, such as forced transfer, the destruction of residential homes and civilian infrastructure, and the destruction of political, cultural, educational, and religious institutions, do not per se constitute acts of genocide, but they are nonetheless relevant considerations as part of the overall factual assessment. They can hence be considered part of the overall genocidal scheme. Additional means that have been taken to attempt to ensure the destruction of the Palestinians of Gaza. And the cherry on top of this whole discussion here about whether this is genocide or not is Israel has still committed hundreds, if not thousands, of individual war crimes and crimes against humanity in the first 2 months of its assault on Gaza. And that's already abhorrent and more than bad enough, whether this happened to fit within the definition of genocide under international law or not. While genocide is certainly considered the most severe crime in the public consciousness, the sentencing for hundreds or thousands of different international crimes would be just as hard as a sentence for genocide anyway. Whatever the maximum is, that's what they would get. So in practical terms, there's really not that much of a difference between a war criminal, criminal against humanity state, and a genocidal state. Indeed, everyone who has ever been convicted of genocide was also convicted of a bunch of war crimes and crimes against humanity on top of that. Nonetheless, this is a clear and undeniable case of genocide, even though all the evidence included here is just what happens to be available now when I'm making this video. Israel's invasion, occupation, and crimes are still ongoing right now. It will be a long time before we get a truly full picture of what they have done, just how many they have really murdered in total, and whether or not they will be allowed to, or will be able to, complete their plans for the expulsion or killing of every Palestinian in Gaza. I've barely included anything here related to Israel's ground invasion of Gaza, for example, because the evidence for the things that they have done on the ground isn't quite as clear yet as it is with the bombing campaign. The case for genocide against Israel is already overwhelming, and it will only get worse for them as more and more evidence of what they're doing comes to light. So, we've established that Israel is committing genocide, but who specifically might be criminally responsible, to the point that prosecuting them could be viable? Of course, in practical terms, it is incredibly unlikely that there would ever be serious international legal proceedings against Israel and its leaders anytime soon, because its status as an ally of the US and Europe protects it from ever really being held accountable. But what if it were possible? Well, firstly, it should be mentioned that the UN Genocide Convention is supposed to be a convention on the punishment and prevention of genocide, and it has provisions within it through which signatories can invoke it and mobilize the UN to prevent genocide from occurring or stop a genocide in progress. Signatories to the convention are also, in theory, obliged to independently take action to prevent genocide when they are capable of doing so. And there is actually a precedent of a country being charged for failing to act to prevent genocide. The Republic of Serbia was convicted on this count during the Srebrenica trials. Serbia was found guilty for claiming they were powerless to stop the genocide, which the court found hardly tallied with their known influence over the Bosnian Serb forces. It could thus be argued that countries with lots of influence over Israel, such as the USA, have violated their obligations under the Genocide Convention in not using that influence to stop Israel. In fact, far from just not doing anything to stop Israel, the US has actively been helping them to carry out their genocide. Their role goes far beyond a mere failure to prevent it, and much more into outright being complicit or an accomplice to it. There is also another official UN doctrine called the Responsibility to Protect, which supposedly obliges member states to coordinate a response to intervene and prevent atrocities from happening. This has in the past been invoked by the USA, UK, and EU to justify their foreign interventions. In this case, however, they are curiously silent. How surprising that no UN member state has invoked the Genocide Convention or the Responsibility to Protect after 2 months has made it even more obvious than ever before that the entire system of international justice and international governance is a total farce. When it comes to the Israelis, absent political interference, the Israeli state would certainly be found culpable for genocide if it were brought before the UN's International Court of Justice. The only reason that Serbia itself was acquitted of genocide in the Srebrenica case is because the genocide was technically carried out by Bosnian Serb paramilitaries rather than the main Serbian military directly. Israel clearly would not get off on those grounds because it's carrying out the genocide in Gaza itself and not through proxies. Among Israeli individuals, those responsible for planning, ordering, and carrying out the genocide would get slam dunk convictions, especially those who have made clear statements of genocidal intent. This means, at the very least, that the trials of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, and many high-level IDF commanders would be little more than formalities before the inevitable guilty verdicts. Even individual soldiers could also likely be prosecuted for genocidal acts. There are precedents from both the Rwanda and Srebrenica cases of soldiers being found guilty for complicity in genocide under the joint responsibility doctrine often used in war crimes trials, even though they only individually participated in a few genocidal acts and were not involved in the overall planning of the genocidal scheme. Things are less clear for Israeli government ministers and other such government officials, whose direct responsibility is not quite as simple to establish due to their lack of any clear military role. Whether someone like a Minister of Agriculture, Heritage, or Finance could be convicted of something related to genocide at trial would likely have to be decided on a case-by-case basis. That said, there are clear precedents indicating that it would be possible, as some former Rwandan government ministers who had no clear military role were convicted of crimes like genocide, incitement to genocide, and complicity in genocide. There are also precedents that point to the possibility that prominent pro-genocide propagandists, such as celebrities and journalists, could be prosecuted for the crime of incitement to genocide, especially if they have government links. For example, a singer was found guilty of incitement to genocide in Rwanda for lyrics in his songs that spread false atrocity propaganda against the genocided Tutsi group. In a verdict for one of these trials, the judges asserted the power of the media to create and destroy fundamental human values comes with great responsibility. Those who control such media are accountable for its consequences. A stern warning that quite a lot of people and organizations should take heed of. Other states and their leaders are also complicit in the Israeli genocide of Gaza. As noted above, the US especially is, but then there's also the EU, Canada, Australia, etc., all of whom are supporting Israel in various ways and to varying degrees. As far as individuals go, US President Joe Biden is the easiest to single out, as he and his team have by far the greatest influence over Israel of any group in the world. Yet they have not only not taken any action to stop the genocide, but have outright abetted it, materially, militarily, and morally, by sending them weapons, sending military forces to cover their flanks, military strategists to advise them, by knowingly spreading false genocide-inciting propaganda and denying the genocide in highly visible and highly publicized press conferences. Massive amounts of the bombs that Israel has been using as its primary means of carrying out this genocide either come from the US or were purchased with American funds. Yet rather than ceasing to ship these weapons, as it has become more and more evident that they are being used in genocide, the US has instead started shipping them even more to ensure that they have a constant supply of ammunition and bombs to murder Palestinians with. And on December 8th, 2023, the USA even vetoed a UN Security Council resolution calling for an indefinite ceasefire in Gaza. They were the only no vote. They know damn well what they're doing and what the results of it are. Yet they've still backed it. Their guilt is undeniable, and there's nothing they can do from here to take back what they've done. The genocide has already happened. At this point, it's just a question of how much worse will it be allowed to be. But while their material and moral culpability is blatantly obvious, whether they're actually legally culpable is a trickier question. It's not at all clear if it would be possible to charge Israel's allies with crimes like accomplice to genocide, complicity in genocide, or incitement to genocide. Because aside from the aforementioned Serbia case, no precedents exist for third countries, their officials, or their propagandists being charged with such crimes for supporting genocide from afar, let alone actually being convicted. At the very least, one would hope that the Serbia precedent would make them criminally liable for failing to prevent it, though they are clearly guilty of far more than just that. Of course, it's very unlikely that trials like these would ever happen, but nonetheless, Israel has committed genocide, and if they were ever prosecuted, the state itself and many Israelis would easily be found guilty of the crime, and their complicit allies very well could be too. Even by the incredibly high standards of international law, Israel has committed genocide against the Palestinians of Gaza, as well as other subgroups of Palestinians in Gaza, such as those of North Gaza and Gaza City. The goals of its assault, beginning in October 2023, are plainly genocidal. This is evident in its actions through dozens of clear statements of genocidal intent from high-ranking government and military officials, and through the existence of at least 2 known genocidal plans. Even though the evidence available to us is very incomplete, what is available is still so overwhelming that Israel's guilt can be affirmed with confidence. At the time of me filming this video, the genocide is still being carried out in real time. The perpetrators have often been frank and open with their intentions, and their actions already speak for themselves. Thousands of different videos and photos of its victims are being uploaded to the internet every day for all to see. A captive, largely defenseless population are being slaughtered and expelled by a powerful military that is trying to render their very existence as an identifiable group in the area impossible. These crimes are being carried out with the world's most advanced military technology, enthusiastically supplied to the perpetrators by the world's most powerful countries. Said countries, despite sometimes throwing out meaningless platitudes during this genocide about the need to avoid civilian casualties, are backing it wholeheartedly. And even if by some miracle they decided to withdraw their support, or Israel stopped, the damage has already been done. The crime has already been committed. Their culpability in this would not be washed away. The dead will not come back to life. Homes will not magically reconstruct themselves. The mental and physical harm done to the survivors will not disappear. The moral stain will not wash out. And while this is going on, supporters and inciters of this genocide are hard at work trying to frame themselves as the real victims, in spite of how flagrantly undeniable the evidence for what they're supporting and inciting is. We must at least ensure that those who deny, support, or who have abetted this genocide are never allowed to forget their culpability. Thanks for watching. New things are happening and new evidence is surfacing every day in Gaza right now, so this video will probably fast become somewhat out of date. Nonetheless, it is a demonstration that even just with the evidence available to me at the time of making it, the case against Israel is already incredibly strong. It's only going to get stronger from here. Just a few days before I finish this video, South Africa filed their ICJ complaint against Israel for genocide, and it's actually very similar to my argument in this video. We will see how it goes from here, or if it's even allowed to go at all. Anyway, if you like this video and you want to see more like it, please subscribe. And if you really liked it, consider supporting me monetarily on Patreon or Ko-fi. It all really helps. Without your support, I could not make videos like this. They take a ton of time, a ton of effort, and a ton of research. Now, I'd just like to thank all of my supporters, and especially my $25 plus supporters: Jel Cribson, Brosnan, Aze Malad, William Tomlinson, Arthur Simak Jones, Robocommy, Exos, Stephen Jordan, Qualia, Mlog, Ron Wing, Tim Wilworth, Lucian, Sammy, Geordie, and my $10 plus patrons: Leaf Fiorine, Christian Corniels, Melissa Gomez, Can't Care Less, XXXX, Justin Bailey 77, Ugopnik, Nabiru, B, Theo Katsaros, Johnny Rocket, Firefox 42, Happy Nephron, Minijan, Eric Perkins, Ant, Max Halland, Jack Paul, Milton Friedman, Sir Splendid, Big Man, Shona, Alan Jensen, Kieran Goodwin, Stefan, Megan Lowndes, Soy Born, Comrade Nat Boulay, Clement Fudge, Hector Obregon, Support Libraries, Jizdog, Thethers, Cockled Badger, and Francis Bananier, and Mira.